Welcome to the MOOC on Indian economy, policy and environment, and we are in the last week of this MOOC, that is week 12, and this is the first unit of that particular module, that is the 12th module. And today we will take up issues related with economic reforms in India. I am Professor Joydeep Barua, Professor and Director, School of Social Sciences, KK Hendricks State Open University. We have so far discussed about the various aspects of Indian economy through our journey and covering the period of about 8 decades. And we have seen the aspects and issues related to Indian economy since independence. And we have basically emphasized on the fact that since independence, it is actually the state-led growth and state-led development which was pursued in India. And as a result of this, we have got certain outcomes and certain performances measured through a set of indicators. And we have tried to see those indicators, tried to analyze those indicators, tried to discern some trends and phases, and also see how those things were responded through public action in terms of policy and also in terms of different the schemes, approaches, and other instruments. In this unit, we are going to discuss about the economic reforms which were undertaken in India in 1990 onwards. We will try to discuss 4 major things in this session. First, we will try to understand the meaning, background, and context of economic reform in India. Then we will try to follow the key components of economic reform in India, and then try to describe the major debates around India. And finally, we will try to evaluate those things which were, as a result, we have got since independence, which can be attributed to the economic reforms program, which will be taken up subsequently. So before I begin, let me give you a very brief about the things that we have discussed. The main argument of this course throughout has been the fact that economic policies are contingent on the nature of the state. The kind of state we have determines the kind of instruments and institutions and also the policies, and based on those instruments, institutions, and policies, we get the economic performances which are measured through a series of indicators. Now, it is very important to understand that economic policy making is a dynamic and continuous exercise. It is been done through a different series of activities over a period of 7 or 8 decades since independence, and it is necessary to respond to different changing situations and requirements. And we have also seen how those things were taken up and in subsequent periods, and how such changing policy has been measured in terms of different indicators. So that we have done, and we have seen that this is actually a dynamic and continuous process. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, 80s, we have different set of policies which were trying to respond to the kind of requirements which were coming up during that particular period of time. Now, economic reform does not refer to such routine changes. Rather, it implies the major paradigm shifts as to how economic affairs are managed in a broader sense. So therefore, the economic reform is more than economic change, policies which are trying to respond to changes in the situation. These are much more deep, fundamental, and wide-ranging. So it has to indicate a paradigm shift. It has to indicate a measure of fundamental, deep, wide-ranging change rather than simple response to a changing situation. So that is important to understand that what actually the economic reform means. We have observed that after independence, India followed economic planning, and we have discussed in detail various aspects of planning, instrumentality of planning, and also sort of evaluate what India could gain after pursuing economic planning in general. And the growth remained moderate, and we have seen that growth during the entire phase remained quite moderate. And despite different approaches, despite different policies, it could not be accelerated. So we have also analyzed the reason for such stagnation were believed to be excessive control by the state. Many people believed within India that if you have too much of a control within the economy, no matter what you do, no matter what policy you pursue, there is a limit of accelerating the growth, because it limits the private initiatives and it discourages the competition. This is one aspect of the thing. The second aspect, which was very important to understand, that kind of insulation of the Indian economy from the global economy. We have started with import substitution projects, and we have the different restrictions on the import. Export was promoted to protect the interest of the domestic producers, and we have introduced high tariffs. There were different restrictions. So therefore, obviously, the Indian economy was sort of separated. It was not integrated in that sense from the global economy. And then in 80s, there were certain evidences that if we try to liberate the economy, and in fact, there were attempts at making some changes within the economy in 1980s, and which were actually giving some sort of results. So therefore, there were evidences, both nationally and globally, that liberalization and opening up of the economy can actually accelerate the growth. Globally, since 1980s, more precisely from 1978 onwards, we have seen that different countries have pursued, including China, a different part of economic progress, that is market-driven economic progress. And that was a kind of economy, and that was a kind of management of the economy that liberated sort of the economic agents so that they can take the best decisions. Competition was encouraged, and as a result of this, there was a charge in the growth rates globally, and within the nation also, we have tried to a limited extent some flexibility within the system, and that resulted positively. So therefore, there were evidences which suggest that if you have that kind of a liberalization, and if you open up the economy a little bit, then there is a possibility that growth rates can be accelerated. Now, we have observed that after independence, India followed the economic planning, and in general, and then growth remained moderated, which could not be accelerated. And reason for such stagnation were believed to be excessive control by the state and insulation of the Indian economy from the global economy was there. So therefore, it suggested that if you want to accelerate, you need to open up, you need to liberate the economy, and then evidences were there in the entire globe, starting from 1978 and onwards, that those economies, those countries which were having that kind of a opening up and then liberation, they were having the growth rates, accelerated growth rates. And India also, we tried little bit of flexibility within the system, and that resulted positively. All right, so that's the idea. Now, very important to understand that during the 1980s, the Indian economy was also witnessing certain problems. It has got twin deficits, which finally led to 1991 economic crisis. This twin deficits was, the first was the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit emanated from ever expanding state intervention in various forms. So as I have stated that since independence, we followed a sort of a path which is driven by the state-led public sector, and that public sector was expanding, and government was having direct say in the economy, how to run the economy. So it resulted in a huge public expenditure, which finally resulted in fiscal deficits. And that was a problem which we have seen that was built up during the 80s, and then finally that was reached the level which is unsustainable. For instance, in 1990-91, the India's fiscal deficit reached 8.4% of GDP, and this become huge because all throughout the deficit has been around 5%, 6%, and when it went up to the level of 9% around, it became unsustainable to continue with the manner in which the economy was managed so far. So that's the kind of understanding that we must have, that when you have a public sector expanding, when you have a state is being involved in the managing of the affairs, obviously it resulted in higher expenditure from the government side, and then finally it resulted in fiscal deficits, and that fiscal deficits went up to the level that is actually the around 9%, and then that is a huge deficit. And then we have got the signal that something is not very correct with the system, which is to be reformed, and that was the idea of having this one kind of internal problem, that is the deficit of in the fiscal front, that how to manage the resources in managing the economy. So that's the idea that we have. The next important point, therefore, was to how to reduce the fiscal deficit. How to reduce the fiscal deficit to an extent so that you can manage your fiscal position, you can consolidate your fiscal position, and then you can continue to do whatever you want to do. Obviously, you require two-pronged strategy. One is that you need to reduce the state intervention so that you reduce the public expenditure, and as well as you generate additional revenues. And additional revenues you can generate through growth, which was not increasing, which could not be accelerated in any case. So therefore, you are caught in the trap that there is a high fiscal deficit coming from higher involvement of state in the management of the economy, which requires a kind of control, which requires a kind of reduction in the state intervention in the economy on one side. And then the second side, you need to have more resources to bridge the gap. The resources can come from growth, and we tried our best, but growth was not accelerated. So therefore, on one side, you have to reduce the expenditure. On the other side, you have to increase the revenue. And the revenue can be grown only out of when there is a economic growth taking place, and that's not happening. So obviously, therefore, you have to rely on other source of revenue, that's debt, public debt. However, the public debt or access to public debt, both domestically as well as internationally, depends on the performance of the economy, which was not good, and therefore it requires a kind of good rating that is contingent of performance. When performance is not good, then obviously the rating is not good. When rating is not good, you are not going to have enough debt, access to enough debt, both internationally and nationally. So therefore, there was a resource problem and other problem that ever expanding expenditure. This together produced a very high fiscal deficit to the level of 9%, and that becomes a problem within the country, that how to go about with the activities that we have done so far. So therefore, two imperatives become very clear in this case, that we need to accelerate the growth simply because you need more resources, and resources that come from the accelerated growth, and also to reduce the fiscal deficit. And these two subsequently become the defining points of economic reforms in India, which was launched 1991 onwards. Now, the second, because it is a crisis of twin deficit, the second deficit is related to the external sector. Alongside the fiscal deficit, which is internal in some sense, the Indian economy was also reeling under balance of payment deficit, as imports exceeded the export along with rising public debt. So on one front, you are having the increase in the public debt. Debt burden is increasing. On the other hand, you have a deficit in the balance of payment because your imports, the value of your imports exceeded the value of your exports. For instance, by June 1991, India had less than 1 billion foreign exchange reserves, just sufficient to meet import requirements for a period of 3 weeks. For instance, suppose you need to have foreign exchange reserve with you. There are two major components. The one, your income coming from exports, and the second, the foreign investment. So these are the two major components of foreign exchange reserve. And with this, you pay for your imports. So you must have enough money, enough reserve with you to take care of your foreign account. That you must have your, just as the individual should have enough money to cover the expenses, the country should also have the enough foreign exchange reserve to cover the cost of import, that you have to pay the import bill, and you need to have that kind of a reserve. And it was so low in 1991 that that was sufficient to cover the import requirements for just 3 weeks. So therefore, since we do not have money enough, that is the foreign exchange reserve during that period, so India was on the verge of defaulting on its international debt obligations. International debt obligations means that the kind of promise that you have made to the investors, external investors, to pay back. And when you are not fulfilling the debt obligations, then obviously your ratings will go down. And once the rating goes down, the investors will pull out, that this is not safe enough to invest in India, so they will pull out money. And of course, the new investment will not be forthcoming. And this precisely happened to India, around 1990-91. So you do not have enough money. So therefore, you are not being able to meet the requirements. Your rating goes down. So people are not interested in investing in India, and they pull out the money, and also no new investments are forthcoming. And when it is not coming, so that is one component, very important component. It is not increasing foreign investment. So obviously, your deficit increases further. So that's the situation that you have. Now, because of these twin crises, that internally you have huge fiscal deficit, which is very difficult to manage, and externally you have a huge BOP deficit, which is also not possible to meet up. And that twin deficits led to a crisis in economic condition of India in 1991. In May 1991, India sent 20 tons of gold to Union Bank of Switzerland. And in July, 47 tons of gold was given to Bank of England to raise a total amount of $600 million. So you need to, you become dependent on debt, you have to mortgage certain property. India had to give golds to different banks to raise money. And India had to secure an emergency loan of 2.2 billion from International Monetary Fund by pledging 67 tons of gold as collateral security. So whatever gold reserve you have to provide as a mortgage to get loan from different countries and international agencies to run your business, run your economy. So that was the kind of situation. And already there was a rumor that country's condition is not good. So therefore, nobody was interested to give you loan in any case. However, since you are providing mortgage, these banks were giving some amount of loans to India. Now, what could be the possible reasons for this crisis building up? The crisis was in the making. Many people argue that crisis was there, crises were growing because of growing fiscal deficit and public debt. Due to the fact that the kind of economy that we have, that was the region, the way we managed our economy, that is how the fiscal deficits as well as the public debt and the BOP crisis deepened. For instance, suppose in 85-86, the internal debt of government was about 35% of GDP. And after 5 years, it has become 53% of GDP. So therefore, half of the GDP is your loan, half of the GDP is your debt, because that you want to finance deficit through public debt. And the deficit of, fiscal deficit was coming from the fact that increasing size of public expenditure, mostly coming from the way we managed the economy. And that's, many people argue that this is the reason. And also in 1990, around 1990, there were certain immediate reasons. Two of those are the fall of USSR. When USSR collapsed, India lost a big partner in export, because USSR supposed to be one of the biggest partner for export for India. When USSR collapsed, the India lost a biggest partner, or one of the biggest partners in export, and that adversely affected the export earning of India. And then finally in 1990, you have the Gulf War. And because of the Gulf War, the crude prices of oil, prices of crude oil increased, and oil being a major component of import, your import bill shoot up. So on one hand, export was going down, and on other hand, import was going up. And because of these two, you have widening gap between the income and export, which resulted in deficits, and that accumulated and become acute around 1990 and 1991. We have this BOP crisis. So therefore, two reasons. One is that it was building up, and then finally, when you have immediate regions like fall of USSR and Gulf War, this become unsustainable to continue with any further. And therefore, India had to go for a program which we call economic reform programs. So that was the background within which you have to locate the kind of activities, kind of reform program that we initiated in India around 1990-91. Now, India's economic reform programs contain two major components. One component is related to fiscal consolidation, and the other part is about structural reforms. In the fiscal consolidation, it required containing public expenditure, that how to increase revenue and how do you manage public expenditure to the extent so that it can be limited, it can be contained, and you can control the fiscal deficit. And that required a kind of limiting state intervention, better management of public expenditure, which resulted in disinvestment in phased manner in most of the PSUs, and that is how this fiscal consolidation was acted on. The second component is more important, the structural adjustments. It encouraged the privatization, liberalization, and globalization. So here, with these two components, the India had declared a paradigm shift from a state-managed economy to a more open market managed economy. And it required a kind of change in the role of state. Earlier, the state was an active partner in managing the economy, which is kind of an interventionist state. Then state became facilitator and enabler. So therefore, this change in the character of the state is very important to understand this paradigm shift. And that is why these programs are called economic reforms, because it actually marks a departure from the earlier phase. It marks a paradigm shift, the way the economy was managed since independence, and then you have a different kind of management altogether coming up following the economic reform program initiated in 1991. Now, it is very important to understand that the economic reform programs have been debated in India in different lines. We have got some very interesting debate, and I will just briefly touch on, and then I will, in the subsequent unit, I will try to sort of make an assessment that how that economy or how economic reforms have been successful. That is the second part. But In this part, we will try to sort of discuss some of the most important debates which are around reforms in India. The first question is that whether reforms were homegrown or dictated. Many believe that these economic reforms were actually dictated by international agencies like IMF and World Bank, taking the advantage of the condition that we were in 1990-91. Because this was the open market management economy, which we call neoliberal economy, was coming up during the period of 1980s throughout the world. It is part of the Washington Consensus. And taking advantage of the situation of India, the IMF and World Bank has actually forced on us certain set of conditions which are there in the structural reform program, making it conditional for support to pull out the country from the crisis. And there are others who believe that this was not dictated. It was an internal feeling and belief within the country that if we continue to do the things the way we have been doing for last 7 decades, it's not going to be sustainable. So therefore, it made a kind of it has become imperative on the part of economy to open up, to liberate, to privatize, and therefore it is actually a homegrown idea. The later on, which was agreed on, which become very consistent with the idea of IMF and World Bank. So you have got a debate around the question that whether reforms were homegrown or dictated, and you have got two positions. The one set of people believe that these are dictated, these are at the terms of the IMF and World Bank, and others believe that these are actually homegrown programs. Then the second question is whether the sequence of reform programs were well coordinated and appropriate. Suppose it started with the budget of 1991 when it was presented by the then Prime Minister, the Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, and then followed by industrial policy and then others. So people believe, and again you have divided opinion that whether the sequence in which these programs were initiated and implemented were appropriate. And many people believe that it is all right, and many people believe that it is not the correct way, because GST was supposed to be a part of this reform program, which were not implemented in the initial phase. It was implemented in a much later stage. So therefore, people believe that had the GST been implemented earlier, the results could have been even better. So therefore, the sequence in which a series of programs were launched and implemented, you have a question that whether these are well coordinated, the measures or appropriate measures, and you have divided opinion on that. The other question, which is also important to understand, is that whether reforms have been sufficient and implemented properly. And many people believe that we have done reforms, but it is not enough. It is not sufficient, that we should have done more, and that is why we are not getting the result. And many people believe that it was sufficient based on the condition, based on the situation, that was the best thing that India could do. And therefore, again, in this question, we have divided opinion as to whether the reforms were sufficient and implemented properly. And then finally, we have the question that whether reforms have been successful in achieving the goals because of which these reforms were actually made. And this is precisely the point that we'll try to discuss in our next unit, assessment of economic reforms in India. So friends, we have come to end of this unit, where we have discussed the conditions, background and context in which economic reforms in India were undertaken. We have tried to understand in a very brief way the major components of those reforms, and then finally we have tried to touch on the basic questions regarding economic reforms in India, around which we have got the debates and discussion, and we have found that there is not a consensus, rather we have divided opinions regarding the debates and questions relating to economic reforms in India. And one of the question which is very pertinent to answer is that whether reforms in India has been successful. So in this unit, we have this question. The answer to this question will be taken up in the next unit. So thank you very much.